when we go off to university, the idea is that we are looking at the unfamiliar, and it's certainly the world doesn't need solutions to problems that are already solved. It needs new solutions.
Inquire and explore and ask questions and generate answers. A lot of effective learning takes place through a process, a cycle of learning, testing, and reflection.
There's no right answer here, but you're being expected to explore and justify and find the evidence to then talk about what you see.
You do have to interpret, you do have to come up with meaning.
And now what we've actually got to do is really think out loud on the page in our writing. And that's the challenge, isn't it, for people?
Absolutely. Application of ideas. Most kids I've worked with can look at this picture and they get it. But can they talk about how they get it? Can they actually explain how that meaning has been created? So it's really about developing that skill of saying more about less.
The worst thing your TOK essay can be is descriptive.
Everything hangs on the topic sentence of a paragraph. The author uses this technique in order to create this conceptual meaning. Don't use AI to give you ideas about what's happening in any text. You will rob yourself of the opportunity to learn the only skill you need to learn. It really is a skills development over 2 years. Like you say, it's so useful in university, it's so useful in the real world, and actually it really does test how well we can do these things on our own.
Hello, Neil. Lovely to see you again. We're going to spend a little bit of time looking together at writing success in English Paper 1 in the IB. Just give our viewers a little sense of your experience of working with the IB, because you didn't always do it. You didn't grow up going to school with this yourself, just like I didn't. So just a minute of your sort of IB journey.
Hi, Matthew. Good to see you again. Yeah, great. So I you're right. I was actually teaching. I grew up in England and studied A-levels in England, and I was actually teaching for quite a few years before I started teaching in the IB. Once I started teaching with the IB, I think it's safe to say I've never gone back. And I started teaching English literature and English language and literature back in the day, and theatre arts. And then about 15 years ago, I started doing workshops for the IB, predominantly teacher training workshops on the courses. And of all the ones I've done, English language and literature is the course where I've done most work. So generally, I sort of travel around the world. I still teach in IB schools, but I've traveled around the world, sort of working with teachers on how to teach for success in this course.
Perfect. So that's going to be really helpful for our students as well, isn't it? And for their parents too, to understand what are some of those areas that people around the world find difficult when they're doing their paper 1 in English, and what you need to really try and get right to maximize your success.
Yeah, I believe as well that actually approaching it the right way does actually lead to more success in the course. There is a sort of philosophy behind the learning. Learning that way leads to more success, and even when it leads to grades that students are slightly disappointed by, they might have hoped for a 6 and they got a 5. We're seeing around the world that universities are really wanting students from the IB to come there because they're so well prepared for university level skills. So
yeah, they are, aren't they? So when we're thinking about writing for success, that doesn't just happen in English, does it? It's happening in every subject area, and like you said, it's why IB students are so well prepared when it comes to them going to college. But look, here are the points that we're going to try and look at today. How IB English differs from traditional study, a sort of overview of the way that English is assessed. Paper 1, that's the first exam paper, what it is and how it varies across the courses. And then some of those key IB English skills that we're developing. So what about that first point there? Let's start with how IB English differs from traditional study. So you've got that background with A-level. Some of our students in India have got the background of other Indian boards like CBSE and ICSE. So where your English questions are almost sort of general knowledge questions about what's going on in books, rather than what we're looking at in IB English. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you summed it up quite well there. In a sense, if we're being very extreme and sort of lacking nuance, if you like, traditionally education generally is about receiving and repeating information. So a teacher tells us things, and we receive that, and then we repeat it, to show that we've heard and hopefully understood it. That really very much across the board in all subjects. So if we look in English, what that means, as you said, is, here are essentially quiz questions about books that we've studied. Maybe we have to write an essay. At A level, for example, I wrote essays, but the essays are about the books, about the subject area. And if we look at the English language side of it, obviously, traditionally, it was very much a test of accuracy of use of spelling, punctuation, and grammar, high vocabulary, things like that. It's not to say those things aren't important. It's not to say that there isn't some reward for these kind of high level skills. But actually, what the IB is asking us to do is to show critical reading and critical understanding. So the ability to read and process information, and make a judgment, interpret it, and then write about it. So we're not really looking for a student who has remembered what a teacher has told them, but we're looking for students who can process all of that information that exists out there in the world and interpret it, understand it, and be able to write about it effectively. And of course, within that, there are a limited marks available for accurate spelling, punctuation, and grammar, but it really is a small proportion, sort of 20% of the mark rather than 90% of the mark, shall we say.
Okay, so look, I've just put that screen up there with the overview of the English language A, or all language A courses, not only English. We've got these titles here: guided inquiry, learner portfolio, concepts and global perspectives, and also close analysis and authorial craft. Do you want to say a few words about these elements of the language A course?
Yeah, so the IB, it talks a lot about guided inquiry, to the point now that you wouldn't find any discussion in IB circles or in international school world that doesn't talk about the best way to learn is through inquiry. To be very short and brief with it, because it's a complicated topic, it's the idea of exploration through generating questions and testing theories, and then ultimately looking towards the goal of transfer. So rather than come back to the receive and repeat model of schools, rather than a student looking to listen to what a teacher says and accurately repeat it, it's a student understanding ideas so that they can apply them to new situations. So if we understand the nature of power, or the nature of communication, or the concept of identity, and we can actually then look at a different text or in a different context, and actually understand, we can transfer understanding to new scenarios.
That's really useful, isn't it? Because certainly when we go off to university, the idea is that we are looking at the unfamiliar, and it's certainly, the world doesn't need solutions to problems that are already solved. It needs new solutions. This is what we're trying to prepare people for, isn't it?
What you said there is really important about the world around us. I mean, I think the IB is really interested in the current world that we live in, how students can address it and make it better. It's not knowledge for knowledge's sake, I think. And as you said there, if we're looking to inquire and explore and ask questions and generate answers, then that is the process that we want students to learn, as I said, rather than repeating information that is already there. As they work through it, they document their journey. So rather than, again, the idea of just receiving information, repeating it for a test, the IB recognise that learning is a journey, and we have stop starts, and we make mistakes, and we have great leaps forward, and we have a few steps back, and a lot of effective learning takes place through a process, a cycle of learning, testing, and reflection. And therefore, part of this course is about actually documenting that in a learner portfolio. It's not assessed in the sense of it doesn't count towards the overall mark, but schools are obliged to do it, and students are meant to be helped to document it carefully for themselves, because the IB recognises actually it's really valuable for the learning journey. Well, just looking at the third bullet point there, concepts and ideas. A guided inquiry is about learning ideas rather than learning stuff. Rather than sort of revising the things, it's about having things to say about bigger ideas that then are transferable. And you mentioned, or we mentioned global perspectives there. It is a global course, and it's meant to be looking at the world around us and global issues in the world. So, in general, students are meant to learn ideas about issues that apply to the whole world and have something to say about it, using evidence from literature and non-literature to support them. And while they're in that process of analysing literature and non-literature to support their discussions of global issues, they need to be able to recognise the features of those texts.
Which is what the point 4 there is about, the choices that the author is making, or that the person constructing a graphic novel or an advertising campaign is making.
Exactly. So, I mean, to make that point as simply as possible, recognizing that a literature text is different to a history text, is different to a science text, and therefore there's no point in using evidence from literature without being conscious of the fact that it is first of all, it's probably fictional, and second of all, it's an art form. So while we can learn interesting things about the real world from those texts, we need to deconstruct them properly. We need to recognize how the tools of that text type are being used to tell a story, to create meaning, or whatever else.
Got it. So look, we'll look at some examples of that in a moment, because it's almost abstract until we really see what they're doing. Let's just look for a moment at the way that language A, and English in our case, is assessed. So we've got a screen here that just shows the nature of the assessment components in terms of sort of traditional exams, and then the individual oral. Can you say just a couple of words, Neil, about how language A is assessed?
Yeah, so we have 4 components, of which standard level students don't do the 4th one. So the students who opt for fewer hours to do English at standard rather than higher level, they'll only do 3 components. But the common component, all of them they're not totally equally balanced, but it's not far away if you look at those numbers. The course is not meant to be a one exam test of everything you have sort of multiple opportunities in different fields, and we'll talk about some of those other ones in a different podcast. But what you actually see is that 2 of those are traditional exams, paper 1 and paper 2, in the sense that they're taken in test conditions at the end of the course. The other 2 are what we would traditionally call coursework. They're done at various points in the course. They have controls in them. They're not totally free. The individual oral feels like an exam, for example. But paper 1 and paper 2 are the 2 traditional ones. And paper 1 is an exam where it's worth the most of any component. And students have to answer about a text they haven't seen before. So again, coming back to that traditional model, if our job is to give students all the information that we know and they can repeat it, then paper 1 becomes exceptionally difficult, because they are not going to be getting a text that they've seen before, or their teachers told them what they mean. So the job is actually to learn how to read and think for yourself and construct an answer. And paper 1 is common to standard level and higher level. The only difference is that standard level kids have a choice of 2 texts to write about, and they write 1 response, whereas the higher level kids, they write about both texts. So they don't get a choice. They just write about one and then write about the other. They have longer.
So this is one of those things that, of course, it adds a bit of pressure, but it's very exciting, isn't it? Seeing something that you've not looked at before, but you've been prepared for. And I know that students find that a bit unsettling. They get quite anxious about it. But I mean, let's be honest. When you leave school, you are only seeing things that you've not seen before. That's life.
And you don't have someone, and unless you have a company where there are two people employed for the same job, one to tell the other one what to think and understand. It's very difficult. And actually, as a teacher, I find um, I feel very confident I can prepare anyone to do well in paper two, because I can actually teach them the stuff
Mm,
and how to write about it. Paper one is exceptionally challenging because we don't know what those texts are going to be.
mm.
And so we need students to be well enough prepared for whatever they come across, but with the ability to read and think for themselves, which is, I guess, the ultimate goal again of conceptual transfer. But it's hard, it's big.
Well, let's have a look, shall we? I've just put up some images of examples of paper one. I mean, they look different. This does not look like an exam paper in the traditional sense. So, what are we seeing here, Neil?
So what they get is they get a non-literary text type, an extract or a text from non-literature. So it's you know what we have there is an extract from New York Times Magazine, an article in New York Times Magazine, an article from National Geographic, um, uh, an infographic of some kind on the right-hand side. If you just look at that page, you can sort of see that there's the whole range. There's the predominantly visual text, the infographic on the right hand side. On the left hand side, you've got a predominantly text, but it does have an image. And interestingly, what students often do is when there's more words than image, they don't comment on the image at all.
Yeah.
And when there's more image than words, they don't comment on the words at all. And the one in the middle is just words, if you like. But they're expected to recognize the features of the text type, how it's presented, and identify the topic and the issue in the text. But the key thing is at the end of each text, there is a guiding question or statement that they have to respond. So they're not just doing what we used to call a commentary on the whole text, but they're actually looking for evidence of the question that's raised at the bottom and trying to construct an answer around that. But they are expected to comment on the words, the images, the layout, the ideas, and how they address that point.
Which and that's exciting, isn't it? Because of course, our students all the time are presented with language and information, but making sure that they're being critical about it, understanding how their attention is being drawn to some things and maybe not to others,
Yeah.
how they're being manipulated, where they're looking at the choices of editors and writers. Should we actually look at an example of the kind of question that they're going to get? Because I think that's going to. I mean, there's another two examples of what you've said. Mixtures of. I mean, that looks like a travel diary
Yeah.
that someone's posted, and then we've got an infographic here about being physically active over lifetime and the type of activities that people are doing.
Yeah. So same as you said, same again, and then the guiding questions themselves, which we'll look at, are then trying to draw the student into constructing an answer to a question. The challenge is, I mean, there's a couple of challenges you mentioned there. Our kids are actually very familiar at receiving text, whether they're very familiar at processing and critically analyzing it, but they're very, very familiar at receiving text. So often you get the text where they say, well, yeah, I know what it says. It's not difficult what it says. But they need to get to that stage of, okay, but how has that meaning been constructed? What how's it been put together? Because that can be quite difficult with some of the infographics. And then when we actually look at the guiding questions, if we go through, we actually do see that they draw students in certain directions. Some are very general. So some say,
Let's have a look at it. Well, we've got one in front of us at the moment. So, how has the interplay of text and images been used to convey the overarching message contained in this infographic? So, what are we looking for there, Neil?
well, that one, I mean, basically, my analysis of it over however many exams we've had now, sort of 10 exams, is that there's two types of questions. There's the ones that basically say, how is text and image used to promote the message of the text? I.e., they don't really commit to what that message is. It's just a helpful frame for the students. This one does actually something a little bit different. It uses the word interplay. So it's not just saying how are text and image used, as some of the guiding questions over those exams have done. They actually are inviting how they work together. But essentially, it talks about the overarching message, but doesn't tell you what that message is. There are others that go a step further and say what that message is.
So is this? It's almost as though there's no right answer here, but you're being expected to explore and justify and find the evidence to then talk about what you see.
Yeah, exactly. And it invites students to draw their own conclusions. And actually, we do know that students who are reluctant to do that, they're still in the mindset, I just want to repeat something my teachers told me, and you can't do that here. So they'll see if they can just say nothing at all, that they're not going to score very well. You do have to interpret. You do have to come up with meaning. I mean, if we look at this next one here, how does this article persuade the reader to rethink their approach to food and eating? Now this one doesn't actually doesn't give any sense of what they should be focusing on. So whereas the other one said text and image, albeit not hasn't gone into any detail on the text, on the techniques, for example, but this one doesn't say anything. It does say two things that are interesting, though. It tells us what the message is. And the message is something about rethinking approach to food and eating. So there is an overarching message there, whereas the other one just said, whatever the message is, how does text and image do it? Then it uses a key command term here, persuading. So it is actually inviting persuasion, and I think any English teacher or language A teacher will know that the language of persuasion is something that is you can actually teach students. It's quite discreet in a way. There are a limited number of techniques that anyone uses when they're trying to persuade, and if we can train our students to pick up on those, then this question becomes a lot easier, even though it's a bit more direct.
So this is one of those things where your extracurricular activities of MUN and debate are going to be valuable. But I do know, certainly within the Indian context, the students that I used to have there have become, with some of their earlier courses in school, very good at sort of obediently remembering and learning what they've been told. And now what we've actually got to do is really think out loud on the page in our writing. And that's the challenge, isn't it, for people?
Absolutely. Application of ideas. In this case, it's application of ideas in recognizing the meaning of the text. I mean, they are going to also have to write a well-constructed answer, but it's actually application of those ideas within the text so they can recognize the meaning and transfer it. So you mentioned the extracurricular activities, the debating skills. Absolutely, they really come in here. The other thing that comes in, interestingly, is if the school is well geared up to a more broad international approach to issues. So it's not just in the classroom we're talking about issues, but there are all kinds of clubs and activities that relate to global issues generally. The service program in the school is related to issues generally, because essentially all of these texts will contain what we would call a global issue of some kind. And students have more chance of being successful in recognizing the meaning and message of a text if they're more familiar with just thinking about the issues of the world more generally. Hopefully their academic classes will help them with that, but if not, then it's incumbent upon us in schools to make sure that those things exist as well. If we just look at the last two guiding questions here, the third one is very much similar to the top one. In a sense, we're talking about text and image as the helpful frame for the student's response. If you can imagine, when they come to write, they'll probably have a paragraph about the text and a paragraph about the use of image. And In that one, it tells us what the text type is. So that was an appeal. And in our classroom, hopefully we've prepared students on some of the text types they might come across and what their features are. It's actually something students can do on their own in revision. They can list off the 10 text types that might come up, and just they could even look up online what would be the traditional features and conventions of those text types, and then sort of train themselves to recognize them. The last one is always a difficult question, because I think even in one's mother tongue, but certainly in a second language or third language, of which many of our students are doing language A, tone is always difficult to recognize. How do we recognize how the text is meant to sound? It's a very high level reading skill. So how is tone used to shape the meaning of this text? Now, a crucial last point on this from me: students must answer the questions. So they can't just say everything they know about this text that they've come across, even if they've understood the meaning of the text really well, and they can do some really good analysis of the images and some of the words and some of the imagery, some of the symbolism. It doesn't matter if they don't answer the question. However, they are allowed to reject the question and set up their own line of inquiry. I always say to students, don't, because it's quite hard. If they do, then the recommendation is that they write their new question at the top of their answer, because it really needs to be clear to an examiner that you're not just failing to answer the question, you're actually answering your own question. And it would probably need to be evident in the what we call a thesis statement, the end of their first paragraph, where they really make clear, this is my line of inquiry. Because I've seen students fall foul of that. They have actually answered their own question, but they haven't made it clear, and the examiner just thinks they're not answering the question, and they score very badly.
That last question is a fascinating one. So, I think we've both taught TOK as well as our subject areas, and I'm thinking there of the way that we often fall into this trap of just reading from one particular set of sources. So, if all I'm doing is reading from The Guardian, the tone that I might hear in something else I'm a little tone deaf, or I'm a little biased sometimes, and I have to really deliberately try and read outside of my comfort zone to look at either side of different perspectives. Hopefully, that's what teachers are doing. That's what we are doing when we're guiding our students, is showing them that the Washington Post and the Jerusalem Post have very different ways of looking at the same thing and writing about it. That's tone as well, isn't it?
Absolutely, and interestingly, I mean, you see in literature as well that it's really important that we choose some diverse literature. There are rules that the IB sets, but some diverse literature that represents different perspectives. But I think it like you said, it's always been the case with our reading of newspapers, for example, and what we try to work on with the students is, imagine that on turbo speed, and you have the way algorithms work in social media. So we really are having the robots themselves creating for us these echo chambers, and it's really dangerous, and it actually does lead to a very sort of polarized society where shades of grey are no longer considered to be feasible positions, and everyone sort of becomes entrenched in completely opposite viewpoints, and it can be dangerous. And I think if we're not teaching students this now, they're never going to learn it, I think, and it's really important.
Looking at those 5 examples of text types that we've seen, I'm imagining that there'll be screenshots coming up in the future exams as well. That's another type. Hey, why don't we look at an actual example, and you just sort of talk us through it? So this is one that you've chosen for us to talk about. We've got some examiners' notes to share afterwards as well. What do you think? We've got 2 cartoons, haven't we? Essentially, the history of technology. Me not happy, still not happy, and the question is that third one there. How discuss how text and image work together to communicate the message of the cartoon.
Yeah, so just a couple of bits of context here that are interesting. Where it says TZ1 in the top corner, that's time zone 1, which is North America. And so there are different exams in North America, say for Europe and Asia. Reason being, of course, one a practical one of, it is possible that students could walk out of Europe and Asia and contact their friends who are 5, 6, 7 hours behind in
Oh,
in,
yeah.
in America, and share the content of the paper. So we have different papers once we get to that stage, and this is a November exam. So certainly for North America, it's different for South America. But for North America, this is probably a paper for students doing resits of paper one in November. Um, a very, very rough analysis of these papers shows that they can be a bit more visual heavy. We in Europe and Asia, we haven't seen too many of these papers that are almost entirely visual, and we do see a bit more of that in the Americas. But basically, here we have, as you said, a sort of essentially a cartoon or a comic strip, depending on those sort of slight difference in definition, the history of technology, and what we'd hope that students recognise here are that the images are more or less identical, and it's the background that changes. And obviously, we have sort of primitive man and modern 21st century man with lots of broken and destroyed and moved on from bits of technology as we keep evolving in that end. Um, I guess it addresses the question that, or answers the question of whether technology itself makes us happy or unhappy, and this takes a fairly neutral stance of that as our eyes sort of move from left to right. It wasn't happy then and isn't happy now. Um, we have this sort of organic versus inorganic juxtaposition. And what I try and talk with students is really trying to recognize that most most kids I've worked with can look at this picture and they get it. But can they talk about how they get it effectively? Can they actually explain how that meaning has been created? And then things like contrast and juxtaposition are ways. The contrast of the living fish and the dead fish on the right hand side, the birds flying on the left and the aeroplane flying on the right, and even the really sharp ones that recognize that on the left the sun is the source of energy, and on the right we have some kind of power station that's the source of energy. But the expression actually on the man's face is identical, and we obviously have that continuation of, he wasn't happy then, not happy now. Really good students could definitely get half a paragraph just out of the words in the speech bubble and the development. So it's really about developing that skill of saying more about less rather than, saying not very much about a lot. But there are images that, I would probably be talking about symbolism, motifs, juxtaposition, a little bit on the words, but a lot more on the actual organic versus inorganic imagery, and building a response around that.
Super. And I know I'll just flip to the next page. So I think this is the marking notes. What are marking notes, Neil?
So each year, when the exam goes off to examiners, the chief examiners have written a set of notes that are things that they could think about. I mean, they're not assuming the examiners can't see things for themselves, but they're recognizing that examiners have a lot of papers to mark in a limited amount of time, and they're saying, these are the sorts of things we should expect. Crucially, they're not exhaustive notes. So they're not saying if a student hasn't said this, they don't score the marks. Essentially, it's about constructing a coherent response. But it is the chief examiner basically saying, if you want to get a level 7 or even a level 6, we expect to see some of this stuff. We don't want to not have that. I mean, coming back to the thing we just discussed, Matthew, lots of students will look at this and have a kind of intrinsic understanding of it. I really believe that our kids are receiving information all the time and making sense of it. But it's whether they can actually break it down and deconstruct it in the right way. So a poor response would probably describe what they see. So on the left-hand side, there's a picture of a caveman in a primitive setting with a sad face, saying he's not happy with his life. blah 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 blah. Um, and then it would carry on describing in that manner. Whereas if we have a look at the marking notes for a better response, it would construct it around the author creating meaning. So and the techniques they use. So the author parallels the images of prehistoric and modern man in order to da 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 da, and that would be the topic sentence of the paragraph. It would then be exemplified. The use of contrast of organic and inorganic matter creates a juxtaposition of culture, but highlighting a lack of evolution of human nature. And that point being, which I think is the broader point of the text, I think, is that technology is not the key to happiness. It's a key to a lot of great things in human life, but we shouldn't think it's the key to happiness or unhappiness.
So you used the word describe to talk about a poor response. It reminds me that also when we're working in TOK, the worst thing your TOK essay can be is descriptive. And what you're actually trying to do is talk about why you think or see something and present the evidence for that belief. So the more sophisticated response is actually looking at those big ideas. And you started by talking about those big ideas, those global themes. And human nature there. You know, we give Nobel Prizes in literature for the exploration of the human condition, not for writing nice descriptive novels.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely, and I think, and at a sort of lower level, not a lower level, but in order to help all students first, we tend to say everything hangs on the topic sentence of a paragraph, a body paragraph, so the paragraphs in the analytical paragraphs in the middle of an essay or a response, and we tend to say if you structure that around author choice effect, then you'll be fine. What only really when a student becomes really really good and consistent and confident with that do we encourage perhaps sounding a bit less formulaic, but initially it really is the author uses this technique in order to create this conceptual meaning. And then if every paragraph starts like that, then you are on the way to analyze. Then just prove
Yeah.
it, connect it, prove it, connect it.
I've just put up the page that you'd made there about what is paper one. So we've actually talked through all of this, but just as a sort of summary then of what we've seen. So the unseen text types, we're making these more sophisticated comparisons about bigger ideas than simply what the words say. Um, let's just talk through each of these points briefly because I think when we've done that, we've actually covered paper one, haven't we? We've given a good indication of what we're doing in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I'd say to students on day one of a course, don't use study guides, and I guess in the modern parlance, don't use AI to give you ideas about what's happening in any text. It's not because they won't give you some very excellent ideas. They will, I'm absolutely certain, but you will rob yourself of the opportunity to learn the only skill you need to learn, which is the ability to interpret meaning, the ability to read a text and read under the surface and try to interpret what is intended and why, and layers of meaning. Once students have been able to interpret meaning and support those interpretations with quotations from the text and discussions of the image and things, then they have shown an understanding of an unseen text, preferably in relation to the question that's been provided, or at the very least in relation to a question that they've provided instead. Then it's about writing a structured analysis, which is, I always believe, our job to show the students how to do it. But an introduction, couple of body paragraphs, probably three, a conclusion, organized in such a way that really makes that argument, and being able to comment on the different text types, visuals, layout features, and always being able to talk about both content and form. So it's not just about the message in the text, the meaning. It's also about how the features of that text type convey that message. So looking at layout, headlines, photographs, use of speech bubbles in cartoons, whatever it is, that sort of thing.
Super. Neil, thanks so much for taking us through that, for giving us a real sense of what this paper one unseen text type analysis really is for our students. And I think that our viewers who are parents will really get a sense that this is very different from what we were expected to do at school, but it's exactly what we might be expected to do in our jobs, in our work. This is real life, isn't it?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. Thanks for talking through it. I agree. It shouldn't be seen as an accident that paper one is worth slightly more than any other component. In theory, it could be answered on day one of the course. So on day one, students don't have to have any knowledge to address the paper. So it really is a skills development over 2 years of the ability to read something they haven't seen before, critically evaluate it, and construct an academic response to it. Like you say, it's so useful in university, it's so useful in the real world, and actually, it really does test how well we can do these things on our own. So it's a different approach to teaching and learning, and it's real life. It's really useful.
Fantastic. Neil, thanks so much. Next time we meet, I think we'll be looking at some of the other elements, the individual oral, and then perhaps we'll get on to paper two as well. But for now,
Look forward to it.
it's been a pleasure seeing you again. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Matthew. Same to you.
There we go.